I want the divorce papers drawn by morning. Nathaniel Carow, 6th Duke of Ashford, said this to his solicitor at 11 o'clock at night in a study lit by exactly 2 candles, his voice carrying none of the hesitation a man might be expected to show when ending a marriage that had, on paper at least, lasted 3 years. The solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Holloway, who had served the Ashford estate for 2 decades and had buried the previous duke without ever once raising his voice in this room, set down his quill very slowly. "Your Grace," he said, "might I ask the grounds for such haste?" "The grounds are my own affair," Nathaniel said. He turned from the desk toward the tall window behind him, where the dark bulk of Ashford House's east wing rose against a moonless sky, one single window lit on the floor above, a small plain room near the back stair, the kind given to upper servants rather than guests. He did not know in that moment why his eyes went to it. He would understand later. He did not understand yet. 3 floors below that lit window, in the room she had been painting in for the better part of a year, Clara Bennet sat at a small table with her sensitive fingers moving across an unfinished canvas, mixing color by feel and memory, and the particular trained precision that had replaced sight in her life 12 years prior. She had heard nothing of the conversation happening in the study below. She could not have heard it through 2 floors of stone and timber, even with the sharpest hearing in England. But she had felt something shift in the house that evening, the way a person sometimes feels weather changing before any cloud appears, and her hands had stilled on the canvas without her quite understanding why, her face turning instinctively toward her own door. It was Mrs. Fenwick who brought her the answer, hurrying down the dim back corridor with a candle held high, her broad face creased with the particular worry she reserved for genuinely significant news. "Miss Bennet," she said, her voice carrying through the door before she had even reached it, "His Grace has called for the divorce papers, tonight." Clara's fingers froze against the canvas. "Whose divorce?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer was not so simple as it sounded. "His own," Mrs. Fenwick said, her voice dropping into something considerably more careful. "From the late Duchess." Clara sat very still. "The late Duchess has been dead these 3 years, Mrs. Fenwick," she said carefully. "One cannot divorce the dead." "That," Mrs. Fenwick said, her voice dropping into something considerably more careful, "is precisely what has half the household talking. He has not said it plainly, but Mr. Holloway came up from the study not 10 minutes ago looking as though he had seen a ghost himself, and the word divorce was on every servant's lips before he had even reached the hall." Clara turned her clouded eyes toward the unfinished canvas on the table before her, though she could not see it, could never see it, could only feel the dried ridges of paint beneath her fingertips where the portrait's face had begun, slowly, over many quiet evenings, to take shape. A face she had never been told she was painting. A face that belonged, she would not learn for some weeks yet, to the very woman whose marriage the Duke seemed determined, by some means neither logical nor legal, to formally end. To understand how Clara Bennet came to be employed in a great house, mixing paint by feel for a portrait she could not see and did not know the meaning of, one must go back 18 months to the late autumn afternoon when she arrived at Ashford House's servants' entrance with a single trunk and a letter of recommendation from the small parish school where she had spent 6 years teaching needlework to younger children by touch alone. She had lost her sight at 12 to a fever that swept through her family's modest household and left her father dead within the same week. Her mother had not survived the following winter, worn through by grief and the particular exhaustion of managing a blind daughter's care alongside her own collapsing health. Clara had been raised after that by an aunt in Yorkshire, a sharp, practical woman who had insisted, against the prevailing wisdom of the day, that a blind girl need not be made useless simply because she could not see. It was this aunt who first placed a brush in Clara's hand at 14, more as an exercise in patience and fine motor control than any genuine expectation of artistic skill. What happened instead surprised everyone, including Clara herself. She could not see color, could not see line, could not see the canvas taking shape beneath her own hands, but she possessed, her aunt discovered through patient years of teaching, an extraordinary memory for the geography of a face once it had been thoroughly described to her. The precise distance between eyes, the particular angle of a jaw, the way light fell across a cheekbone as someone read its shape aloud, syllable by careful syllable, until Clara's fingers had memorized the description as thoroughly as a musician memorizes a difficult passage. She painted from description and from touch when touch was permitted, and from something else as well that her aunt never quite found the words to name and that Clara herself understood only imperfectly, a kind of attentiveness to voice and silence and the small telling details that sighted people generally overlooked entirely, details that somehow in her hands found their way onto canvas with an accuracy that unsettled more than one subject who sat for her. She came to Ashford House at the recommendation of the parish vicar, who had heard that the great house required a companion for the housekeeper's elderly mother, a position requiring patience and gentle conversation rather than sight. Clara took the position gratefully, glad of steady wages and a respectable household, and it was Mrs. Fenwick herself who discovered within the first month the trunk of brushes and pigments Clara had carried with her from Yorkshire. "You paint," Mrs. Fenwick had said, with the particular surprised delight of a woman who had not expected this small detail about her new companion. "I do," Clara had said, "though I understand it puzzles people, given the circumstances." "It does not puzzle me," Mrs. Fenwick had said. "It delights me. Will you paint something for this house, Miss Bennet? We have portraits enough of dukes and duchesses long dead. I find I would like to see what a living hand makes of them." Clara had begun, over the following months, with small studies, a bowl of fruit described to her in patient detail by a kitchen maid, a view from the east window relayed sentence by sentence by Mrs. Fenwick herself. It was the housekeeper, eventually, who suggested the project that would consume the better part of a year and unravel, in the end, considerably more than anyone in Ashford House had anticipated. "There is a portrait in the long gallery," Mrs. Fenwick said, one evening some 4 months into Clara's residence, "of the late Duchess, Lady Rosalind. I have always thought it a poor likeness somehow, though I could never say precisely why. I wonder whether you might attempt your own version from description and see whether something truer emerges." Clara had agreed with the particular professional curiosity that any commission produced in her, and Mrs. Fenwick had begun, across the following weeks, the slow and patient work of describing the late Duchess's portrait to her, in painstaking detail, the shape of her face, the particular auburn of her hair, the green of her eyes, the jewels at her throat, the elaborate fashion of her gown. It was on the 3rd such session, as Mrs. Fenwick worked her way down from Rosalind's throat toward her hands, that something in the housekeeper's voice changed very slightly, in a way Clara's trained ear caught immediately. "Her right hand rests on the arm of the chair," Mrs. Fenwick said. "Her left hand—" She paused. "What of her left hand?" Clara asked. "It is behind her back," Mrs. Fenwick said slowly, as though noticing the detail herself for the first time, despite having walked past this same portrait several times a week for 3 years. "I do not believe I have ever properly looked at that before. How strange! Every portrait of her that I can recall, and there are several in different rooms of this house, shows that same left hand behind her back." Clara's fingers stilled on the canvas before her. "In every portrait," she said, "the same hand, the same position." "Yes," Mrs. Fenwick said, her voice carrying the particular unease of someone who has just noticed a pattern they cannot yet explain. Clara did not respond immediately. She sat with the detail for a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over any unusual fact relayed to her, searching for the shape it might eventually take, and found, to her own mild surprise, that some part of her, not logic exactly, something closer to the instinct that had always guided her brush toward accuracy she could not consciously verify, wanted very much to understand why a woman would choose, in portrait after portrait, across a span of years, to hide the same hand. Clara worked on the portrait across the following months with a thoroughness that exceeded any previous commission she had attempted, asking Mrs. Fenwick increasingly detailed questions that the housekeeper answered with growing unease of her own, as the small accumulated details of Lady Rosalind's life and death began gradually to take a shape neither woman had anticipated when the project began as a simple artistic exercise. She had asked early on the ordinary questions any portraitist might ask: the Duchess's height, her bearing, the particular quality of her voice as Mrs. Fenwick remembered it. She had asked about the gown in each portrait, the jewelry, the season each was likely painted, working to construct, in her own mind, a complete and accurate picture of a woman she would never see and had never met. It was the hidden hand that kept drawing her back across the weeks in a way she could not entirely account for through ordinary artistic curiosity alone. "Did the Duchess wear a ring on that hand?" Clara asked one evening, the two of them seated together in the small sitting room Clara used as her painting space, the fire low and the house otherwise quiet around them. "A ring," Mrs. Fenwick repeated, considering. "I do not recall noticing particularly, though I confess I never had reason to look closely at her hands. She was not, if I am honest, a woman who invited close observation. There was a quality to her, even when she stood directly before you, of remaining somehow at a slight distance." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. Mrs. Fenwick was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. "I mean that she was beautiful and gracious in the way society required, and entirely correct in every visible particular," Mrs. Fenwick said slowly. "And I never once across the 2 years I knew her before her death felt that I had actually met her. Does that make any sense to a person who cannot see faces?" "It makes a great deal of sense," Clara said. "I have met people my entire life whose faces I cannot see, and whose true selves I could not locate regardless. The face is not always where a person actually lives." Mrs. Fenwick laughed softly, though something uneasy remained beneath the sound. "You have a strange wisdom, Miss Bennet," she said. "I confess it unsettles me sometimes, the things you notice that the rest of us walk past entirely." It was perhaps 3 weeks later, as Clara worked on the final details of the portrait's gown, that she asked the question that would eventually unravel everything. "How did the Duchess die?" she asked. Mrs. Fenwick's silence stretched long enough that Clara set down her brush entirely, turning her clouded eyes toward the housekeeper with the particular attentive stillness she brought to any moment she sensed mattered considerably more than its surface suggested. "Mrs. Fenwick, how did she die?" "A fall," Mrs. Fenwick said finally, her voice carrying a careful flatness that Clara's trained ear recognized immediately as the sound of someone reciting an official account rather than speaking from genuine memory. "Down the main staircase, late at night. She was alone in the house, the Duke having travelled to London on estate business, and the servants found her at dawn." "You do not believe that account," Clara said. It was not a question. Mrs. Fenwick did not answer for a long moment. "I believe what I was told," she said eventually, in the careful voice of a woman choosing her words with considerable deliberation. "I have never had reason to believe otherwise." "But," Clara prompted gently. "But," Mrs. Fenwick admitted, "there are details that never sat entirely comfortably with me in the years since. The staircase she supposedly fell down is wide and shallow, with a sturdy banister the full length of it. I have walked it 10,000 times in the dark myself, half asleep, without ever once losing my footing. And the position in which she was found—" She stopped. "What position?" Clara asked. Mrs. Fenwick's voice dropped nearly to a whisper, as though some old habit of caution had reasserted itself even now, alone in a quiet room with only a blind young woman as her audience. "Her left arm," she said, "was beneath her body, tucked behind her back, exactly as it sits in every portrait that was ever painted of her." The room held the silence that followed for a long moment, the fire crackling softly, the unfinished portrait sitting on its easel between them, a woman's hidden hand finally, slowly beginning to suggest the shape of whatever truth it had been concealing all along. There is a particular kind of attention that the world rarely credits properly, the attention of someone who cannot rely on sight and who has therefore learned to notice everything else instead. The hesitation in a voice, the detail no one else thought worth mentioning, the pattern hiding in plain sight precisely because everyone else was too busy looking at the surface to notice what the surface was concealing. Clara Bennett was never meant to uncover anything. She was simply asked to paint a portrait, and she brought to that ordinary task the same patient, thorough attention she brought to everything in her life, because patient, thorough attention was the only tool circumstance had ever given her to work with. If you have ever been underestimated for a limitation that turned out in the end to be the very thing that let you see what others missed entirely, you already understand exactly what this story is building toward. Subscribe to Regent Hearts right now if this has found you. Hit the bell so the next story reaches you the moment it arrives. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell us honestly, have you ever noticed something important specifically because everyone around you was too distracted to notice it themselves? What Clara discovers next is going to change everything the Duke believes about his own marriage and about himself. Stay with us. Nathaniel Carow had not, in truth, fully decided to divorce a dead woman. He understood, in the cold light of the following morning, exactly how mad the demand had sounded to Mr. Holloway, and exactly how mad it would sound to anyone else who learned of it, and he understood that he could not properly explain, even to himself, what had driven him to make the demand at 11 o'clock the previous night in the first place. It had begun, if it could be said to begin anywhere, with a letter. He had been going through Rosalind's old correspondence, a task he had avoided for 3 years since her death, and had finally forced himself to undertake only because his solicitor required certain estate documents that her private desk apparently still contained. He had found, tucked behind a false panel he discovered entirely by accident while searching for a missing deed, a small bundle of letters that had nothing to do with estate business at all. They were love letters, not from him, addressed to Rosalind in a hand he did not recognize, spanning a period of nearly 2 years before her death, and they described in considerable and unmistakable detail an affair that had apparently continued throughout the entirety of their marriage's final stretch. Nathaniel had sat with those letters for the better part of an afternoon, his careful, controlled composure cracking apart in private for the first time since the funeral, and had arrived by evening in a fury so complete and so disorienting that the only outlet his mind could construct for it was the absurd, legally meaningless gesture of demanding a divorce from a woman 3 years in her grave. He had not told Holloway about the letters, he had not told anyone, he had simply arrived in the study that night with the fury still burning and made a demand that satisfied nothing and explained nothing, and left his solicitor staring at him as though his employer had finally, after 3 years of careful grief, lost his mind entirely. In the morning, with the fury banked into something colder and more controlled, Nathaniel summoned Holloway again and rescinded the demand with the same flat finality he had issued it. "I spoke rashly last night," he said. "There will be no divorce. There is, as you correctly observed, no living wife to divorce." Holloway, with the particular tact of a man who had served this family long enough to know when a question would not be welcomed, simply nodded and made no further mention of it. But the household had already heard by morning every distorted version of the previous night's demand, and the strange story of the Duke who had tried to divorce his dead wife travelled through the servants' hall with the particular speed reserved for genuinely unusual gossip, eventually reaching Clara Bennet's small sitting-room by way of Mrs. Fenwick, who relayed it with the careful neutrality of a woman determined not to add her own speculation to an already strange tale. Clara listened to the account with her fingers resting still on the unfinished portrait before her, and felt something settle into place that she could not yet fully name. "He found something," she said quietly, once Mrs. Fenwick had finished. "Found something," Mrs. Fenwick repeated. "Among her things," Clara said, "something that changed how she understood her. That is the only explanation that accounts for both the suddenness of the demand and the swiftness of its withdrawal. A man does not arrive at such a demand from nothing, and a man does not abandon it so quickly unless the original fury, however genuine, ran up against the cold recognition that fury alone changes nothing." Mrs. Fenwick stared at her. "Miss Bennet," she said, "you reason like a magistrate." "I reason like a person who has spent 12 years listening very carefully to everything anyone says, because listening carefully was the only investigation available to me. I find the habit does not switch off simply because the subject has changed." It was perhaps a week after this conversation that Nathaniel Carow, restless and unable to settle into any of his ordinary occupations, wandered by chance into the small sitting-room where Clara's unfinished portraits were kept, and found himself standing before an easel holding a half-completed likeness of his dead wife that unsettled him more thoroughly than any of the formal portraits hanging in the long gallery ever had.
He did not know at first what precisely disturbed him about the painting. The face was recognizably Rosalind's, the auburn hair, the green eyes, the particular set of her chin that he had once, in the early infatuated months of their courtship, found enchanting and had come by the end to find merely cold. But there was something in the composition that no formal portrait painter, working from life with a living, breathing subject seated before them, had ever quite captured, and it took Nathaniel several long minutes of standing before the easel to identify exactly what it was. The hand. The left hand, hidden behind her back, painted with a particular careful emphasis that made it, despite its concealment, the single most important detail in the entire composition. "Who painted this?" he asked, when Clara entered the room behind him, alerted by Mrs. Fenwick that the Duke had been found standing alone before the unfinished canvas for the better part of a quarter-hour. "I did, Your Grace," Clara said, her face turning toward his voice with the small unconscious tilt that accompanied every sound she oriented toward. Nathaniel turned to look at her properly for the first time, a small, fair young woman in plain dove-grey wool, her pale, clouded eyes drifting slightly off his face in a way that told him, even before Mrs. Fenwick's quiet explanation reached him a moment later, that she could not see him at all. "You are blind," he said, with the particular blunt directness of a man too startled by the contradiction before him to manage tact. "I am," Clara said, without apparent offense at the bluntness. "I have been since I was 12. "Then how," Nathaniel said, gesturing at the canvas, before remembering a half-second too late that the gesture meant nothing to her, "did you paint this? It is—" He stopped, searching for words that would not sound as mad as the question itself felt. "It is uncannily precise. The likeness is correct in every detail I can identify, and the hand—" He stopped again. "What of the hand?" Clara asked, and something in her quiet, careful voice told him she had been waiting for precisely this question for some weeks. "You have painted it hidden," Nathaniel said, "behind her back, as though it conceals something." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Does it?" she asked finally. Nathaniel felt something cold move through his chest. "What do you know?" he asked, his voice dropping into the particular dangerous quiet that those who knew him understood to signal genuine alarm rather than calm. "I know what Mrs. Fenwick described to me," Clara said. "Every portrait in this house shows that same hand, hidden in the same position, and I know that the position in which your late wife was found, at the foot of the staircase, placed that same arm under her body, tucked behind her back in a manner Mrs. Fenwick has found troubling for 3 years and never had cause to mention to anyone until I began asking unusual questions about a painting." The room went entirely silent. Nathaniel stood very still, his right hand closing without his conscious direction into the loose fist that signaled to anyone who knew to look for it that his composure had just been tested more severely than it had been tested in a very long time. "Are you suggesting," he said slowly, "that my wife's death was not an accident?" "I am suggesting," Clara said, with the particular careful precision of a woman who had spent 12 years learning never to claim more certainty than the evidence actually supported, that a detail has been hidden deliberately and consistently across every formal representation of your late wife that exists in this house, and that the same detail appears again at the scene of her death in a manner that strikes me, and apparently struck Mrs. Fenwick, as considerably too convenient to be coincidence." Nathaniel looked at the half-finished portrait again, at the hand hidden behind a dead woman's back, and felt the careful, controlled grief he had maintained for 3 years begin for the first time to crack open into something far more dangerous. "I require you to finish this portrait," he said, "and I require you to tell me everything else you have noticed, regardless of how small or how strange it may seem." Clara's clouded eyes turned toward him, and something in her bearing, not triumph, but a kind of grave, settled resolve, told him she had been waiting in truth for this exact request since the very evening she had asked Mrs. Fenwick about a hidden hand and felt the shape of something important beginning slowly to surface. "I will need to ask you questions you may not wish to answer," she said. "Ask them," Nathaniel said. "What did you find," she said, "in her belongings, whatever it was that drove you to demand a divorce from a dead woman in the middle of the night?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Few people in the household had dared raise the demand directly with him since its withdrawal.
"Letters," he said finally. "Love letters from a man who was not me, spanning nearly 2 years before her death. Do you know the hand, the writing? I did not recognize it. I have considered since whether I ought to have shown it to someone who might." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her sensitive fingers moving faintly at her sides in the particular gesture that Mrs. Fenwick had explained to Nathaniel once, signaled that Clara was composing something in her mind before she had quite decided to say it out loud. "I would like to hold the letters," Clara said finally, "if you are willing. Paper carries more than ink, Your Grace. The pressure of a hand, the particular weight of how a person writes when they believe themselves unobserved. I cannot read the words, but I may be able to tell you something about the man who wrote them regardless." Nathaniel brought the letters to Clara's sitting room that same evening, against every instinct of propriety that ordinarily governed his conduct toward household staff, driven by a need for answers that had outpaced entirely his usual careful concern for appearances. Clara held the first letter for a long moment, her fingertips moving slowly across its surface, tracing the impressions left by quill and ink with the particular concentrated stillness she brought to any task requiring her full attention. "The hand is practiced," she said finally, "educated. The pressure is even, a man accustomed to writing a great deal, comfortable with the pen, not laboring over the words."
"That tells us little," Nathaniel said. "Half the gentlemen of my acquaintance write with practiced, even hands." Clara's fingers continued moving across the page. "There is a particular catch," she said, "here, in the lower corner," as though the writer paused mid-sentence and pressed the quill down too hard while considering his next word. "A habit. Most writers have some small physical tell when they hesitate. This one presses down rather than lifting the pen entirely." Nathaniel watched her with growing fascination, despite the gravity of the conversation. "You can tell all that from touch alone?" he asked. "I can tell what touch reveals," Clara said. "Whether it means anything useful I cannot yet say, but I have learned over many years that small physical habits are often more honest than the words people choose to write. A man can disguise his prose, he rarely thinks to disguise the pressure of his own hand." She continued through the remaining letters, building sentence by sentence and impression by impression a careful picture of the man who had written them, educated, comfortable with correspondence, possessed of the particular pressing pause habit she had identified in the first letter and confirmed across several others. "I would need to compare this hand against a known sample," she said, finally, once she had worked through the entire bundle. "The pressure pattern is distinctive enough, I believe, that I could identify it again if given something else this same man is known to have written." Nathaniel considered this for a long moment, his mind working through the limited circle of men who might plausibly have conducted a 2-year affair with his wife without his own knowledge or society's wider gossip ever catching wind of it. "There is one possibility," he said slowly, working through the logic with the same careful deliberation Clara had brought to the physical evidence. "There is one possibility that I find myself reluctant to examine and equally unable to dismiss." "Who?" Clara asked. "Edmund Price," Nathaniel said, "my late wife's own brother." Clara's fingers stilled on the final letter. "Her brother," she repeated. "By marriage only, in the sense that mattered for scandal," Nathaniel said. "Rosalind's father remarried after her own mother's death, and Edmund is the son of that second marriage, no blood relation to Rosalind at all, though society has always treated them as siblings for the sake of convenience.
He has managed a portion of the estate's affairs since her death at my own invitation, given his familiarity with certain accounts. I had no reason until this moment to suspect him of anything beyond ordinary financial competence. "Bring me something in his hand," Clara said, "an estate letter, a ledger entry, anything definitively his." Nathaniel left within the hour and returned with a stack of estate correspondence bearing Edmund Price's unmistakable signature and several pages of handwritten notes regarding tenant rents. Clara worked through them with the same careful, methodical attention she had given the love letters, her fingers tracing each line, each pause, each small physical habit the paper itself had preserved. "It is the same hand," she said, finally, her voice carrying none of the dramatic weight the revelation deserved, only the same careful precision she brought to every observation. "The pressing pause appears here, and here, and here again. I would stake my reputation on it, Your Grace. Edmund Price wrote those letters to your late wife." Nathaniel sat very still, the full weight of the revelation settling over him with a slowness that felt almost merciful, as though his mind required the gradual arrival of the truth in order to absorb it without shattering entirely. "If Edmund was Rosalind's lover," he said slowly, working through the logic with the same careful deliberation Clara had brought to the physical evidence. "If Edmund was Rosalind's lover," he said slowly, working through the logic with the same careful deliberation Clara had brought to the physical evidence, "then he had motive to wish her marriage to me concluded, and if she threatened at any point to end the affair, or to expose it, or simply to become inconvenient to whatever arrangement he had constructed around it." He stopped. "Then he had motive to wish her dead as well," Clara quietly finished. The fire crackled in the small grate, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, the full shape of what they had uncovered settling into the room with the particular heavy silence that accompanies the recognition of genuine, irreversible danger. Edmund Price arrived at Ashford House 3 days later for what he believed was an ordinary quarterly review of estate accounts, and found, instead, Nathaniel waiting for him in the study with an expression that made Price's hand rise, almost immediately, to straighten his cravat, the small nervous gesture Nathaniel had noticed in retrospect appearing with increasing frequency across the preceding years without once considering what it might signify. "I have a question regarding the accounts," Nathaniel said, once the customary pleasantries had been exchanged with a coldness Price seemed not to fully register. "Of course," Price said, settling into the chair across the desk with the particular easy confidence of a man who had grown comfortable over 3 years, believing himself entirely above suspicion. Nathaniel withdrew the bundle of letters from his desk drawer and set them on the surface between them without comment. Price's face went through several rapid changes, confusion, then recognition, then a swift visible drain of color that confirmed everything Clara's careful analysis had already established beyond any reasonable doubt. "I do not know what those are," Price said, the words arriving half a second too late to carry any real conviction. "You wrote them," Nathaniel said, "to my wife, across nearly 2 years. Price began, and then stopped, his hand rising again to his cravat, straightening it with the particular agitated repetition Clara had predicted would intensify under pressure. "We have confirmed the hand," Nathaniel said, conclusively. "There is no profit in denying it further, Edmund, and I find myself increasingly indisposed towards patience."
Price's composure collapsed with a swiftness that suggested he had been bracing in some private corner of his mind for exactly this confrontation for considerably longer than 3 years. "It was not," he began, and then stopped again, visibly searching for words that might soften what could not in truth be softened. "It began before your marriage, before you ever met her. We had an understanding, Rosalind and I, long before her father arranged the match with you. I had no fortune to offer her. You did. She chose practicality. I did not blame her for it."
"But you continued the affair, regardless," Nathaniel said, "throughout our marriage." "We never stopped loving each other," Price said, and something in his voice carried, despite everything, a thread of genuine, wretched feeling that made the confession considerably harder to dismiss as simple calculation. "I am not proud of it. I have spent 3 years attempting to forget her entirely and have failed at every attempt." Nathaniel's hand closed into its familiar fist. "Did you kill her?" he asked. The question landed in the room like a physical blow. Price's face went entirely white. "No," he said, the word arriving with an immediacy and a horror that struck Nathaniel, despite everything, as genuine. "God, no. Nathaniel, I loved her. Whatever else I have done, whatever shame I carry for it, I would never have harmed her. I was in London the night she died. I can prove it absolutely. A dozen witnesses can attest to my presence at my own club that entire evening." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, searching Price's face for any sign of the calculated deception Clara's analysis had led him to suspect, and found instead something that looked, despite every reasonable instinct toward continued suspicion, genuinely like grief. "Then who," Nathaniel said slowly, "killed her?" Price stared at him. "You believe she was murdered," he said. "The and," Nathaniel said, "the position in which she was found, the portrait she insisted across years on having painted the same way every single time, concealing the same detail." Price's face carried a confusion that seemed, to Nathaniel's careful scrutiny, entirely unfeigned. "I do not understand what you mean about a hand," he said. It was at exactly this moment that Clara Bennet, summoned by Mrs. Fenwick at Nathaniel's earlier instruction, entered the study. Her clouded eyes turned toward the sound of his voice rather than toward Price, whom she could not see and had never met. "May I ask Mr. Price something?" she said, addressing Nathaniel directly. Her clouded eyes turned toward the sound of his voice rather than toward Price, whom she could not see and had never met. "Ask," Nathaniel said. Clara turned her face toward Price. "Did Lady Rosalind wear a ring on her left hand that she did not wish your husband, that she did not wish the Duke to see?" Clara asked. Price's breath caught audibly. "How could you possibly know that?" he said. Clara's expression remained carefully neutral. "I did not know it. I am asking it, because the hand in every portrait of her is hidden, and a hidden hand generally conceals something a person does not wish observed. Tell us what the ring was." Price was quiet for a long moment, his earlier composure entirely abandoned now, his face carrying the particular exhausted relief of a man finally permitted to set down a secret he had carried alone for considerably longer than was good for him. "It was mine," he said finally, "a ring I gave her years before her marriage, when we believed, foolishly, that circumstances might eventually allow us to marry properly.
She wore it always, on a chain beneath her gown where it could not be seen, except on the occasions she sat for a formal portrait, when she would slip it onto her finger for the duration of the sitting and conceal the hand entirely, unable to bear leaving it off, and equally unable to risk it being seen and recognized for what it was. Nathaniel sat with this for a long moment, the explanation arriving with a kind of devastating mundane simplicity that somehow made the entire affair considerably more painful than any more dramatic revelation might have. "It was not murder," Nathaniel said slowly, "the hidden hand. It was love, misplaced, dishonest, considerably more painful than I would have wished to discover, but simply love, hidden out of necessity rather than concealing any crime at all." Clara's expression carried something complicated, relief certainly, that the darker possibility she and Nathaniel had both feared appeared unfounded, but also a careful, unsatisfied attention that suggested she had not yet finished examining every thread of the matter. "The ring explains the hand in the portraits," she said slowly. "It does not yet explain the position in which she was found at the base of the staircase, nor why Mrs. Fenwick has found that detail troubling for 3 years. Nathaniel and Price both looked at her. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel asked. "A woman wearing a hidden ring on a chain might conceal her hand in a portrait sitting. She would have no particular reason to fall in a manner that tucked that same hand under her body at the foot of a staircase in the middle of an ordinary night, with no portrait being painted and no audience to see it." The room went very quiet. "We have explained one mystery," Clara said. "I do not believe, Your Grace, that we have yet explained the one that actually matters." It was Mrs. Fenwick, ultimately, who provided the detail that finally unlocked the true circumstances of Rosalind Caro's death, though she did not realize when she first mentioned it how significant the small recollection would prove. Clara had asked over the following days to speak with every member of the household staff who had been present on the night of the Duchess's death, working through their accounts with the same patient, methodical attention she had brought to the letters and the portraits, listening for the small inconsistencies and unconsidered details that her trained ear had learned across 12 years of compensating for sight she did not possess, to catch where sighted people generally missed them entirely. It was a footman named Davies, the last servant to see Rosalind alive that evening, who mentioned, almost in passing, that the Duchess had received a visitor earlier that night, before the household had retired, a detail that had never made its way into the official account of her death, because Davies had simply assumed at the time that the visit was unremarkable and therefore unworthy of mention to the magistrate who had briefly, cursorily investigated the death 3 years prior. "Who visited her?" Clara asked.
"I did not see his face clearly," Davies admitted. "He came to the side entrance after dark, and the Duchess herself instructed me not to announce him formally, which I thought odd at the time, but did not question, given that she was mistress of the house and entitled to receive whom she pleased." "What did you notice about him?" Clara pressed. "His voice, his bearing, anything at all?" Davies considered this for a long moment. "He spoke with a London accent, polished, the kind a gentleman uses," Davies said finally, "and he wore a ring, I noticed, only because it caught the lamplight as he removed his glove, a signet, gold, with some manner of crest I did not recognize." Clara's fingers stilled. "Would you recognize that crest again," she asked, "if it were described to you or shown to you?" "I believe I might," Davies said. Clara turned toward Nathaniel, who had been listening from across the room with growing tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "Your Grace," she said,
Do you possess any record of which families in the county bear a gold signet with a crest distinct enough that a footman might notice it by lamplight alone?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through the limited circle of families whose business might have brought a gentleman caller to his wife's side entrance after dark on the precise night of her death. There is one possibility that had not previously occurred to me, because I had no reason to connect it to anything beyond ordinary estate business. "Who?" Clara asked. "Lord Ashworth," Nathaniel said, "my own second cousin and Rosalind's most persistent suitor before our marriage was arranged. He never fully reconciled himself to losing her to the match, and I had assumed, across the years since, that his continued coolness toward me sprang from simple wounded pride rather than anything more substantial." "Bring Davies something bearing Ashworth's crest," Clara said. "If the footman confirms the match, we will have our visitor." It took 2 days to obtain a sample of Lord Ashworth's seal, procured discreetly through Mr. Holloway's careful inquiries among the county's other solicitors, and when Davies was shown the wax impression, his recognition was immediate and unhesitating. "That is the one," he said. "I am certain of it." Nathaniel sat with this confirmation for a long moment, the full shape of the night finally, slowly assembling itself into something he could examine directly, rather than merely suspect. "Lord Ashworth visited my wife, alone, after dark, on the night she died," he said slowly, "and told no one in 3 years that he had been present in this house at all." "That alone does not prove murder," Clara said carefully, ever cautious about claiming more certainty than the evidence actually supported. "But it proves beyond reasonable doubt that the official account of that night, that she was alone in the house, that her death was a simple accident witnessed by no one, was false from its very foundation. Someone was present. Someone has spent 3 years ensuring no one discovered it." "We must speak with Ashworth directly," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying the particular flat, dangerous calm that Clara had learned across the preceding weeks to recognize as his genuine fury rather than its absence. "I would advise caution," Clara said. "A man capable of concealing his presence at a death for 3 years is a man capable of considerable further deception should he sense the truth closing in around him." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I have spent 3 years grieving a woman whose death may not have been the accident I was told it was," he said. "I find I have very little patience remaining for caution." The confrontation, when it came, took place not at Ashford House, but at Ashworth's own modest country estate 2 days' ride distant, Nathaniel having decided, against Clara's continued advice toward caution, that the confrontation required the element of surprise his cousin's own territory would deny him entirely unless he arrived without warning. He brought Clara with him, against every convention of propriety such a journey would ordinarily demand, because he had come, across the preceding weeks, to trust her careful, attentive judgment more thoroughly than he trusted his own increasingly furious instincts, and because some part of him suspected, correctly, that Ashworth would find it considerably harder to lie convincingly to a woman's whose particular attention to voice and hesitation he did not yet understand he ought to fear. "You visited Ashford House the night Rosalind died," Nathaniel said. "I require the truth, Ashworth, and I require it now." Ashworth's face across the following silence went through the same rapid sequence of denial and recognition and collapse that Edmund Price's had undergone days earlier, though the confession that eventually emerged carried a considerably darker weight than Edmund's wretched simple admission of love. "I went to ask her to leave you," Ashworth said finally, his voice carrying none of his earlier confident hospitality.
I had loved her since before our marriage was arranged, and I had convinced myself, foolishly, that if I simply asked her plainly enough, she might finally choose differently. "What happened?" Nathaniel asked. "She refused me, plainly, without cruelty, but without any hesitation either. She told me she had made her choice years before and had no intention of revisiting it, regardless of whatever feeling either of us still carried." "And then," Clara prompted gently, when Ashworth's account faltered into silence, "and then I left, through the side entrance, as I had come. I did not see her fall. I did not push her, Nathaniel, whatever suspicion you have apparently constructed around my silence these past years. I left her alive and well at the top of that staircase, and I learned of her death the following morning along with the rest of the county, and I have lived with the particular cowardice of never once admitting I had been present at all, because I knew precisely how it would appear, and I had no proof of my innocence beyond my own word." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, searching for the calculated deception he had half expected to find, and locating instead, much as he had with Price, something that looked uncomfortably like genuine long-carried shame. "If you did not push her," Nathaniel said slowly, "then who did? She did not simply fall down a staircase she had navigated daily for 3 years, in a manner that left her arm tucked under her body, exactly as she concealed it in every portrait she ever sat for."
Ashworth's face carried genuine confusion at this. "I do not understand the significance of her arm," he said. It was Clara who answered, her voice carrying the particular careful precision she brought to any observation she had turned over thoroughly enough to trust completely. "It is not significant on its own," she said, "but combined with everything else we have learned, it suggests a body arranged rather than a body fallen. A woman who trips and tumbles down a staircase does not generally land in so deliberate a position. Someone moved her after the fall, or caused the fall in a manner calculated to produce exactly that appearance." Ashworth's already pale face drained further. "If I left her alive at the top of the stairs," he said slowly, working through the logic with visible, growing horror, "then someone else was in that house after I departed, someone who found her there, alone, and ensured that whatever encounter followed left no witness capable of telling a different story." Nathaniel's hand closed into its fist. "Who else knew you intended to visit her that night?" he asked. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. "I told my own steward," he said finally, "that I intended to call on Ashford House privately, on a personal matter I did not wish recorded in my usual appointment ledger. I did not consider at the time that he might mention it to anyone else." "What is his name?" Nathaniel asked. "Mr. Caldwell," Ashworth said. "He has served my family for almost 20 years. I would have trusted him with my life." Clara's fingers stilled, her clouded eyes turning toward Nathaniel with the particular sharp attentiveness that signaled to anyone who had learned to read her properly across recent weeks that something significant had just clicked into place. "Your Grace," she said slowly, "does the name Caldwell mean anything in connection to Ashford House itself?" Nathaniel's breath caught. "Caldwell," he said slowly, "my late father's steward before my own time was a man named Josiah Caldwell. He retired from service some years before Rosalind's death, but his son—" He stopped. "His son inherited the position with Lord Ashworth," Nathaniel finished slowly, "the same family, connected to both households across 2 generations." The 3 of them sat with this discovery in a silence that carried finally the genuine weight of a conspiracy reaching towards its true shape.
not a single villain, but a tangled web of old loyalties and old grievances that had apparently converged on one specific night 3 years prior into a tragedy no one had properly examined until a blind maid's careful attention had begun, painting by painting and question by question, to pull the threads apart. It took a further 2 weeks of careful inquiry conducted by Mr. Holloway under Nathaniel's direct instruction and with Clara's continued guidance regarding which questions mattered and which servants' accounts carried the small inconsistencies worth pursuing further, to assemble the complete account of what had actually happened on the night Rosalind Carrow died. Caldwell, when finally confronted directly with the accumulated evidence, did not maintain his denial for long. He had indeed learned at Ashworth's intended visit to Ashford House, and had gone to Ashford House himself that same night, separately, on an errand entirely his own, a long simmering grievance regarding wages he believed his father had been owed and never paid by the previous Duke, a grievance he had decided with the particular reckless desperation of a man who had nursed a resentment too long to address directly with the current Duchess while her husband was conveniently absent in London. He had found Rosalind already shaken by her encounter with Ashworth, and his own demand, pressed with considerably less restraint than the situation warranted, had escalated into an argument that ended, by his own eventual confession, with a shove he had not intended to be fatal, but that sent her backwards down the staircase she had been standing near, the fall itself accidental in its specific outcome, even if the violence that preceded it was entirely deliberate. He had panicked in the aftermath and arranged her body in a manner he believed would suggest a simple accidental fall, tucking her arm under him in his haste, without any particular calculation beyond simply wanting the scene to look as undisturbed as possible before he fled the house entirely. The same panic that had driven him to flee, also driving him in the years since to maintain a silence his own father's old connection to the household had made considerably easier to sustain than it might otherwise have been. The magistrate, presented with this complete account, alongside Caldwell's own eventual signed confession, secured by Mr. Holloway's careful legal pressure once the accumulated evidence made denial no longer sustainable, proceeded with the prosecution that Rosalind Carrow's death had never received 3 years prior, when a hurried, incurious initial investigation had simply accepted the convenient appearance of accident without examining the considerably more complicated truth beneath it. Nathaniel sat with Clara in the small painting room some days after Caldwell's confession had been formally recorded, the unfinished portrait of his late wife now finally completed, her hidden hand resolved into the simple, sad truth of a concealed ring, rather than any darker concealment, her death resolved into a tragedy of converging grievances, rather than the calculated murder he had half feared discovering. "I do not know how to properly thank you," he said, watching Clara's clouded eyes turn toward his voice with the small, unconscious tilt he had come to across these recent weeks to find genuinely affecting, rather than simply curious. "You need not thank me," Clara said. "I painted a portrait. The truth assembled itself from details that were always present, waiting for someone with sufficient patience to notice them. You assembled it," Nathaniel said. "I have lived in this house for years, surrounded by the same portraits, the same servants, the same small unexplained details, and I noticed nothing. You arrived 18 months ago and saw—" He stopped, correcting himself. "You perceived, in a matter of months, what the rest of us walked past entirely." Clara's expression carried a small, careful warmth that Nathaniel found himself increasingly across these recent weeks anticipating with an eagerness he had not permitted himself to examine too closely. "I had nothing else to occupy my attention beyond careful listening," she said. "That is not virtue, Your Grace. It is simply circumstance, turned towards whatever use it could find." "I find I disagree," Nathaniel said. "I have known a great many people with perfectly functioning sight who could not have done what you have done these past weeks. Attention of the kind you possess is not merely circumstance, it is a particular form of care applied consistently, regardless of whether anyone troubles to notice or value it properly." Clara was quiet for a long moment, something in her bearing carrying a vulnerability Nathaniel had not previously seen from her across the entire careful, methodical investigation they had conducted together.
"I have spent 12 years being valued, when valued at all, for my usefulness," she said finally. "As a teacher of needlework, as a companion, as now an investigator of household tragedies. I find I have not often been valued simply for my own company, separate from whatever practical service I might provide." Nathaniel reached for her hand, the small gesture carrying a deliberateness that surprised him even as he made it. "I find," he said quietly, "that I value your company considerably beyond its usefulness. I have valued it, if I am honest, since the evening I first stood before your unfinished portrait and felt something shift in my own understanding of what attention, properly applied, might actually accomplish." Clara's fingers curled gently around his, her clouded eyes turned fully toward him despite their inability to see his face, orienting toward his voice and his nearness with the particular trust that had grown across these recent intense weeks into something considerably warmer than simple professional partnership. "I find," she said softly, "that I value yours as well." Clara Bennett arrived at Ashford House to paint a portrait and uncovered instead a truth that the world's careless first investigation had entirely failed to find, not because the truth was hidden so cleverly, but because no one had thought a blind maid's careful attention worth troubling over, until a duke, restless with grief he had never properly examined, happened to stand before her canvas and finally ask the right question. If this story found you somewhere real today, if you have ever possessed an attentiveness the world dismissed as a limitation and discovered eventually that the very thing others underestimated was the thing that let you see what they could not, then you already understand exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to Regent Hearts right now if you have not already. Hit the bell so the next story finds you the moment it goes live. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell us honestly, did you suspect the hidden hand concealed a ring, or did Edmund Price's confession catch you exactly the way it caught Nathaniel? Share this with someone who needs to remember that the people the world overlooks most easily are often the ones who notice everything else. The next story is already waiting. We will see you there.